the trauma that people experience that has to be life-threatening or that can result in serious injury can happen instantaneously. You could be in a car accident, for example, that's life-threatening, or it can go on for a long time. A person might be subjected to wartime experiences for a long time, or particularly people in childhood who are sexually or physically abused over a long period of time. Now, the next slide, please, which states that not everyone develops post-traumatic stress disorder. It's very hard to predict who will and who won't, and it depends very much on a person's upbringing, their attachments, how their personal ego strengths and so forth, genetic factors as well, and of course the duration and severity of the trauma. If it's really, really frightening trauma, if there's a shocking earthquake or something like that, of course there's a higher risk that people will develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And then there are social and cultural factors too. And I think it's important to remember that people's circumstances can determine whether they will react badly to trauma. If they've got a lot of social supports or they're in a very strong culture, then potentially they're less likely to. But again, there are no hard and fast rules. So what's the frequency? Well, as Tanya's already pointed out, it's a pretty common disease. MAPS, the organisation in America that's doing a lot of the research on this, has said that 1 in 7 servicemen who've come back from Afghanistan and Iraq come back with post-traumatic stress disorder. My college, the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, has said that 5 to 10% of people in Australia during their lifetime will develop the condition. So that's just a bit of an introduction. So what is post-traumatic stress disorder? How does it work? And I wanted to no, we're not ready to leave it there. How does it work? It's basically, I'll give you a personal account of it. I like to bushwalk. I'm a great bushwalker. I like to get out into the bush. And where I walk, like a lot of parts of Australia, there are snakes everywhere. Brown snakes, tiger snakes, all sorts of snakes. So I'm walking along and I'm not really looking out for snakes. I'm aware that there might be snakes. But when I come across a snake, I have this immediate reaction. I always just jump back. I don't have time to think. The snake's there and instinctually I jump back. That's a fight-flight reaction. If we could go to the next slide now. And you'll see in that cross-section of the brain, there's a spot there called the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is in the old part of the brain, and mammals, for time immemorial, have the amygdala, which is the smoke alarm of the brain. It's there to detect threatening situations. So I see the snake, immediately my amygdala fires off, and I go into a fight-flight. Hormones are secreted, there's neurological discharge, my respiration rate, I'm breathing fast, my heart rate goes up, and I'm ready for action, either to fight or flight. In the case of the snake, I'm happy to jump back. I jump back, and I then settle down, and my prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the newer part of the brain, which is the part of the brain that is much more sophisticated. It's the part we think with, we work things out, we imagine with. It's a more sophisticated part of the brain. It starts to take over. It says, Nigel, that was a snake. Everything's cool. Stand here and wait for the snake to go back into the bush, or you can walk around the snake and you'll be safe. So I'm calmed down, and with that, the memory of that snake, the situation, I then put into the filing cabinet in the brain, which I call the hippocampus. That's where you keep your memories. I settle down, I'm thinking clearly, I'm not so fearful, I walk around the snake and I keep walking, and I've seen so many snakes in my lifetime that I can happily do that. I've had all sorts of snake experiences. I'll tell you one. Many years ago, I was doing a meditation retreat, and during a session, I was a bit stressed. I went outside and I lay in the long grass quietly, with my eyes closed in the sun, and I felt this thing on my chest, and I look up. Just as I looked up, the tail of a tiger snake disappeared off into the grass. Fortunately, I didn't go into a fight-flight response. God only knows what the snake would have done. So I know a lot about snakes. So when I get home after my walk, my wife's English, she hates snakes. She'd say, "You see any snakes?" And I say, "Yeah, I saw one." And she immediately goes into a fight-flight reaction vicariously without even seeing snakes. But that's another story. So that's how the brain works. And when you process the fright or the trauma or whatever it is, and everything's back in place, the brain works properly. But what happens in post-traumatic stress disorder is that the amygdala doesn't stop firing off, and the prefrontal cortex doesn't take over and make you feel calm and worked out and relaxed about your situation. And the memory of the trauma doesn't get put into the filing cabinet in the brain. It's still active and still causing you problems. You're still very conscious of it. And so this leads to the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so hopefully with that little sort of metaphor, and it's only a metaphor, one of the things about, I should say about post-traumatic stress disorder, it's one of the few conditions that psychiatry can now really lay claim to and link brain and mind. So much of psychiatry, we don't know pathogenesis. We're not really sure of how the treatments that we have work. In this particular case, I'm reasonably confident now that we understand this linkage between brain functioning and consciousness. I'll be talking about this at another webinar. It's a great interest of mine. But what goes on inside your mind and how that's related to the brain functioning. One of the things about brain and mind is science has not yet been able to explain consciousness very well. But this is a model that I think is very helpful. So what are the diagnostic criteria? If we could have the next slide. These are the diagnostic criteria that make up the condition. We have intrusive symptoms. Why do we have intrusive symptoms? Because the memory hasn't been shelved in the memory bank, in the filing cabinet. We have flashbacks of whatever it was. It might have been a car accident or a plane crash or whatever it was, some sort of physical abuse, a fight, and intrusive memories and nightmares. It keeps coming back. And if we go back to the place where we had the trauma, we become very hyper alert. We become very hyper aroused. So we avoid that situation. There's an avoidance thing. A lot of people who have been traumatized don't want to go out. They become a little bit agoraphobic. They avoid situations where they might be reminded of a perpetrator who's traumatized them, or a situation in a car accident where the accident happened. Next slide, please. Furthermore, can you imagine then being in a situation where you have been traumatized and the smoke alarm's continually going, the memory's still there, you're stuck in that place? That's the basis of a post-traumatic stress disorder. You're reliving that awful memory, and it's hard work to do that. After a while, you start to feel terrible. You have negative alterations in mood, and also you have this thing which is very common in post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, please, these are a wide range of symptoms, and everybody manifests symptoms in different ways, and there are different pictures. This isn't everybody. This is, I'm giving you the whole picture here. Different people manifest different symptoms, obviously. But what happens is you get this dissociation. It becomes very exhausting to be constantly hyper alert and vigilant and so forth. And so the brain starts to switch off. It can switch off from emotions, it can switch off your memory, and it can switch off from the body. This dissociation is very common. And so people who have been traumatized often they don't want to go back into the trauma. Their memory of it gets switched off. And with all this going on, they have very negative thoughts and ideas. And people who have been sexually abused, children and so forth, there's confusion about their alliance to the person who's abused them. There can be fear and guilt and shame. They're not sure if they caused the abuse or not. All these things can happen. It's a very complex, wide-ranging spectrum of symptoms. But the exhaustion of the whole thing can decrease motivation. They're very tired, partly because they're not sleeping well, and they get detached, this dissociation. So if we can go to the next slide, you'll see that the other thing, of course, is increased arousal. If the smoke alarm's going off all the time, people are always jumpy, they get very angry, and there can be other manifestations like reckless behaviour. I won't go into that at the moment, but they're jumpy, they have increased startle response, their memory and concentration is affected, and if they're constantly aroused, their sleep is affected adversely. And there's this disconnect. And if you can imagine, and some of you may have experienced it, I don't know, but if you never have been traumatized and all these things are going on and you're living in the past, you're not in the moment anymore, then there's obviously going to be social and occupational dysfunction. People start to fall apart and they can't manage socially and they can't manage occupationally. I've seen this in all sorts of ways. I just wanted to, on the point of the onset being slow or late, it's quite interesting. people, I saw a lot of Vietnam veterans, and I still see veterans. They come back from the war, they're ostensibly all right, but there's still stuff going on, and their lives begin to fall apart. They can't cope with relationships, they become increasingly isolated, they're self-medicated, and many of them end up living by themselves in terrible situations and drinking too much. So it can be a slow onset, but this hyper-arousal and so forth can happen very quickly. I've seen people recently who were in the Burke Street disaster where that fellow ran everybody over, and I've seen people who were in that terrible catastrophe, and they immediately went into shock and hyper-arousal, and immediately their functioning deteriorated quite markedly and stayed that way. So there's a broad picture of people. The other thing that's interesting too is recently with the virus, I've seen 2 cases of old men who have been reminded of terrible things that happened to them. One was a fellow who is 90 now and functioning very well, but he was in Auschwitz and he lost all his family, came to Australia, did very well, was an academic, retired, and thought he'd coped. But then with the lockdown, he suddenly couldn't cope with the lockdown, this inability to get out and do things, and all the memories of Auschwitz came flooding back. And there was another fellow who was in Changi, which was a Japanese prisoner of war camp, and he's in an old age home, and he got locked into his room virtually, and the same thing happened to him. So it's a broad and wide presentation, and everybody has an idiosyncratic way of presenting. So how do we treat post-traumatic stress disorder? Now, Tanya's already referred to the treatment, and I want to talk about current treatments just very briefly, but I would like to say that there are a lot, I think it's very important to understand that there are a lot of good psychologists and psychiatrists out there now doing good work and helping a lot of people. Sure, we can improve things, but there are a lot of good people doing it, and I think that it's important for us to remember that. And what we're trying to do with psychedelic treatments is improve on the good work that people are already doing. So what are the current treatments? If we could have a look at the next slide. My college, the College of Psychiatrists, recommends 2 or 3 primary treatment modalities. One of them is trauma-focused counselling. What we have to do, if we've got these people in a state of hyperarousal, or they've disconnected, whatever it is, their brains are not functioning and they're stuck. And so the important thing is that people have to go back and reignite the memory and reprocess the memory. Get the memory that's frightening back into the filing cabinet in the brain, the hippocampus, get the prefrontal cortex going again and quieten down that old amygdala. That's really the basis of trauma-focused counselling, confronting the memory and looking at all the distortions that have occurred and trying to replace them with a rational alternative. Now, if we could go to the next slide, we'll see that there are other ways of treatment, the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which some of you may know about, where the therapist moves his or her finger across the patient's eyes, and the patient or the participant has to follow the movement of the eyes. And for some reason this works, whether it's related to rapid eye movement in sleep. I'm not really sure of the mechanism. It tends to be more of a non-verbal approach. People just seem to be able to reprocess quite effectively with it, and it does help some people. It doesn't help everyone, but it does seem to have a positive effect with a group of people. And the third one are antidepressants, and like cannabis, a lot of people treat themselves with cannabis. All that does is suppress symptoms. It doesn't solve the problem, and there are a lot of side effects. And I put in self-medication because an enormous number of people who are traumatized do tend to drink too much or use cannabis. And look, cannabis can be helpful, but it doesn't solve the problem. So how effective are current treatments? If we could have the next slide. I think Tanya alluded to this, that a third of the people do get better. So there is good work being done. A third get a little bit better, there's some reduction, but a third of people, there's no change. And this is not necessarily, I'll explain that that's not necessarily correct, that third. It might not be as good as that. So let's go to the next slide, which are the problems of treatment up until now. The problem with the treatment is it's really bad. It's really hard for people to go back into the trauma. They don't want to know about it. Many people present and they'll give you a sort of, patients I see, they'll give you a sort of story about what happened, but they're not really truly emotionally investing in that trauma. They're giving you a sort of an off-pat account, but they don't want to get aroused by it, understandably, because it's too overwhelming. And this is the great problem with current treatments, that people have this, they can't go into what we call this vortex. It's like an anxiety vortex. As soon as they start to go there, they just freak out and they don't necessarily pursue the treatment. And as you can see at the bottom, there's a high dropout rate. 25 to 50% of people who try this don't get very far with it. So that in itself might distort that third ratio of third getting better, third not getting much better, and a third really getting worse or not showing no improvement. So I think it's probably, I've seen so many people who have gone to well-meaning psychotherapists and don't really make much progress, and they just have to live with their problem. So what we're talking about, next slide please, is the window of tolerance. The therapy that is provided, how tolerant is the person to this going back into the trauma and dealing with it. This window of tolerance isn't very wide, and in order for it to be there in a therapy situation, the therapist has to provide a very safe and reassuring environment. It has to be a good relationship so that the patient trusts the therapist. And of course, if people are getting anxious, they've got to learn relaxation techniques, physical relaxation techniques, mindfulness and so forth. And the therapist provides education as to what the process is all about. So this is the reprocessing of traumatic events. But as we know, this window of tolerance is our limitation. How do you widen the window of tolerance? And this is where MDMA comes into it. Methylene dioxymethamphetamine is the drug that we hopefully will be using to widen the window of tolerance. Why does it widen the window of tolerance? Because it's one of the only drugs that we know of that's an anxiolytic. It lowers anxiety levels without putting people to sleep. Giving people Valium, they might feel more relaxed, but they're likely to go off to sleep. Whereas MDMA is a stimulant. It's also an empathogen, which means that you can relate better to the therapist and to you and to yourself. You feel better about yourself. You're more self-accepting. So it gives you a very positive state of mind in which you can go into the therapy and go back into the trauma. And this is the work that's being done in the research that's started. It facilitates retrieval and reprocessing of inner material and enlarges the window of tolerance. So let's go to the next slide. And it's said, quite interestingly, that MDMA precipitates. Have you moved on to the next slide, or am I? We've got a bit of a mix-up. Anyway, what it does is it's sort of an inverse traumatization. The experience is very intense on MDMA. It's far-reaching, but it has a positive valence. It has the opposite effect of a traumatic experience. It deepens the inner process. It allows for verbalization and reprocessing. So in MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, if we can move on to the next slide. No, the next slide. That's it. We've caught up with ourselves. There are 4 principles that I would adhere to with the therapy. First of all, obviously, it's a non-violent, gentle, non-directive approach. There's no confrontation. The therapist is there to support. The therapist is there to encourage healing as opposed to precipitating increasing levels of anxiety. We teach mindfulness or relaxation practices. Mindfulness is both a principle of self-awareness, but there are also relaxation and mindfulness practices, which you may know about. And I work as a psychiatrist, and my concept, my idea of psychiatry takes into account four aspects that are important. Psychiatrists have to be aware of physical and body processes. They have to be aware of psychological and mental processes, obviously, and also social processes and environmental and cultural factors. Just an aside here, in the old days when there was some sort of third world catastrophe like an earthquake or a volcano erupting, immediately people would send in a plane load of therapists to do some sort of psychotherapy. But what we've realised is that's a very Western psychiatric approach. And often, if the culture is not like our culture, which is very individualistic, these cultures are often more homogenous, and people are very self-supporting. There's a sort of cultural feel. Everyone's part of something rather than individualistic. The way that people are treated in best management in those cultures is that everybody sticks together and they support one another and they live together, and they might bring in a spiritual advisor or a priest or someone. But they don't need this individualistic psychotherapy. So we've got to keep in mind in psychiatry that culture is very important. We think that everybody's like us. They're not. And finally, the most important thing I think in psychiatry is spiritual or meaningful ideas. We all need meaning in our lives. And I think that psychedelic psychotherapy, and I'll be talking about this in the next webinar, is very much part of this, that people without meaning, without connection in life, really do struggle and really do suffer. So they're the 4 principles that I apply to MDMA-assisted psychotherapy or any psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So next slide, please. We're doing trials, and I'm pleased to say that there's a small trial in Western Australia that's hopefully going to start soon using MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, and I'm trying to initiate a trial here. We're a little way down the road with that. To get into a trial and to really be able to have treatment with MDMA, what are the criteria? Well, we treat people over 18. They've got to have had treatment, the standard treatments already for PTSD, the ones I've talked about, and they haven't worked. People can't be pregnant because of the drug. We don't want to treat, at this stage, people with psychedelics who might have psychotic family history of psychosis or a personal history of psychosis. We don't want to treat people who may have significant physical problems such as cardiovascular or liver disease. We don't want to treat people who have over-abused ecstasy. I really think that a sort of psychedelic naivety is a bonus in these treatments, but it's not essential. And we don't want to treat people who have a significant history of substance abuse and can't get off substances for the trial. So if we could go to the next slide, the elements of therapy, there's humanistic concepts. I've mentioned some of those, non-directive approach with the emphasis that the healing comes from the individual. The therapist is there to facilitate the healing, but it's got to be an inner self-healing process. The participant in the trial or in the treatment does the work internally. The work is done, and we have faith that this work will be done appropriately and come to the surface. And the storyteller is more important than the story. That just simply means that as a therapist, I've heard millions of stories, but I'm more concerned with the person who's telling the story than the story. The story is the fuel that keeps the engine going, but we're there to help the storyteller work through their own story. So that's why the storyteller is more important than the story. And of course, in any psychotherapy, there are psychodynamic concepts. How does the individual relate to the patient, or the participant relate to the therapist? And there will be psychodynamic transference issues. It's interesting, we're doing a study at the moment which is about to get going on psilocybin for depression. And the psychotherapy is very much part of that as opposed to the drugs. The researchers are very keen to do measurements, but it's very hard to measure relationships and how transference issues are relevant. So that's an issue that we're facing at the moment. You can't measure psychotherapy, I don't think. Some people might think you can, but when psychodynamic issues come in, it's very hard to measure it. But anyway, the psychodynamic aspects are very important as well. So if we can have the next slide. You probably all know this, the treatment, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. There are 3 stages: the preparatory stages, where the individual, the participant, meets the therapist, gets to know them. There's psychoeducation, they learn meditation, mindfulness techniques. They're prepared for what might happen in the dosing session, and that's the next substance session. This is a 6 to 8 hour session where the person takes the medication and does the work. And then that has to be, what's crucial is the integration following the dosing session, where the person comes to terms with the experiences they've had during the dosing sessions. The changes that they might perceive are important, what they've learned, and the integration is there to sort of anchor these insights, these changes into the person's future behaviour. The setting is very important. Set and setting are very important. These are terms that came up. Timothy Leary, the famous psychedelic man, back in last century talked about set and setting. It's very important for people to go into a dosing session with the right mindset. You've got to go in there hoping to heal yourself through the session, through the work, and the setting's very important. You don't want to be taking psychedelic drugs outside Flinders Street Station at 1 o'clock on a Saturday morning. You want to be in a safe, comfortable, pleasant environment where you feel safe. And you've got two therapists. Music is very important because music's more important than talk, because music evokes emotions, and that's very important in this therapy. People wear eye shades and they wear headphones, so the music is a crucial part. Now, the dosage that we're proposing in our trial will be 80 milligrams of MDMA. I've said we encourage trust in the inner healing process. And one of the things that's very important in psychedelic psychotherapy as opposed to normal psychotherapy is that physical sensations are very important. And we have to take that into consideration. So many people will manifest discomfort or tightness or tension, or they'll want to move and get rid of energy. And this is very important. And the therapist has to have permission to have physical contact, non-sexual physical contact. And that's all worked out before in the introductory sessions. But one of the things that happens is that if the therapy is working, often people want to manifest physical sensations. They often want to move because often the reprocessing of the trauma works with a sort of physical catharsis where that energy is released. Often it's released easily, but sometimes it can be blocked. And this is where physical help, resistance movements, and a little bit of massage, that sort of thing might be of assistance. And the therapist, of course, is the facilitator. Now, I just want to finish off with just to talk a little bit about integration. As I've mentioned, it's very important. It follows the session quite closely, and any distress or dilemmas are discussed, and benefits and insights are reinforced. It's important, I think, that people, after they've had the MDMA treatment, learn processes to help themselves. They might want to do creative things like draw or write. They might want to keep a journal. They want to learn techniques which are relaxing, such as meditation, or get them in touch with the body, yoga. Physical exercise is very important, and reflection and so forth. So one of the things that's often talked about in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder is post-traumatic growth. And I want to finish up on that, because the very things that people with significant post-traumatic stress disorder lack are the very things that we want to encourage and manifest in people who have the treatment and successfully have the treatment. Often people with post-traumatic stress disorder are locked in this situation where they're not in the moment, they can't relate to others around them, they have no joy in life because they're stuck in this traumatic memory. So hopefully with the treatment, they begin to relate to those around them. They become much more positive and closer to the people who are important to them, because often there's a sort of block there that disallows that. People, the joy of life, we should all have the joy of life, hopefully. And often these people who are suffering don't have that appreciation of life. And the release from the trauma can often make them feel worthwhile again, and that life is worthwhile and positive. They're free to have imagination. Because the prefrontal cortex is not working, that's where your imagination lives. They can't think ahead, they can't plan. And part of life is imagining things that might happen to you, or planning things, or working out strategies that are positive. So that also hopefully will be an outcome of this treatment. You'll feel better about yourself, and you will make connections which you weren't otherwise able to do. You'll have meaningful, maybe spiritual connections with the world around you, and also that you maintain strength and resilience in the long term. So that was a mouthful. I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Okay. Nigel, thank you. A big round of applause, everyone. So knowledgeable, and we're so lucky to have you on our advisory panel and working with us, and we value your contribution enormously. And we're going to come to some questions in a moment. Ilan, if I could just have the final slides there. I'm just going to, a lot of people have asked us how they can help Mind Medicine Australia to make sure that these medicines do become accessible and available to people around Australia. And so ways that you can help is start conversations, share the information with your contacts. We have a wonderful Learn section on our website, and you can learn all about MDMA and psilocybin and a whole range of journal articles and other educational resources there and videos and so on. There's also volunteering opportunities. So we have a lot of skilled volunteers. We had some in the office today and constantly have people who are wanting to work with us and help us achieve this important mission. Reading our content, sharing it, sharing our social media platforms, talking to your doctors and medical professionals so that they get up the curve as well. I know that there's a lot of psychiatrists on this stream tonight. As well, of course, we are a charity, so it's incredibly important for us to have other donors who are supporting this mission, and there's a lot of work to be done, so we rely heavily on other donors, which can be both large and small donors, and we value every one of you. There's ways to make regular monthly donations, and we have well over 100 regular monthly donors. We're very grateful for those, as well as our major donors. You can follow us on social media, of course, talk to your local MPs, and attend our educational events, the summit, and so on. And the next slide, please, Ilan. So this is about the summit. It's a 2-day pre-summit introductory workshop program in psychedelic therapies, therapists, health professionals, members of the public, which will be run by Janice Phelps from the California Institute of Integrative Studies, Renee Harvey from Imperial College, Maria Papasparou from the UK. It's an exceptional lineup. And then the 2-day summit featuring all of these, really the leaders in this space globally, and also some wonderful Australians, and more people will be announced as time goes on. And is there any more slides, I think? The rest of our webinar series. Yep. So we're now up to next Wednesday, Anxiety and Optimism and the Paths Through the Pandemic and Beyond next Tuesday, May the 12th, with Dr. Mark Cross, who's a psychiatrist from Sydney, who has just released a wonderful book on anxiety. And then on May the 20th, which will be Dr. Nigel Strauss's next webinar with us, which is on psychiatry and psychedelics. We're also very excited to announce that in June we'll be holding a session on sexual abuse and post-traumatic stress disorder, and we will send out notifications on that. So there's more webinars coming, and we look forward to welcome you to those. So now we'll bring Nigel back on screen, and we'll attempt, and I've got Peter Hunt here as well, and we will attempt to answer your questions. So we'll start off with some of the pre-registered questions. And one thing we'd love to do, which we'll do in a few minutes, is we'll actually open up for a chance for people who are here to ask questions. Pardon? I think that's not a good idea. Yeah. You will get a chance to unmute yourselves quite soon if you want to ask another question. So I think we have Nigel there. Well, Nigel's iPad is there. Oh, Nigel's there now. Hi, Nigel again.
Hi.
So I've got you and Peter, and I'm just going to start going through some of the questions for this session. So we'll start off with this one, which I think you might like to answer, Nigel. Actually, this came on the chat screen just before. How do you work spiritually with patients, especially with those who aren't aware of this self-dimension?
Oh, that's a hard question. The problem with the word spiritual is it means so many different things to so many different people. And in my business, in psychiatry, it's not a word that's very often used, except in the sense of meaning. I'm very much, and I'll be talking about this again, meaning is a crucial part of people's lives, and it really translates into connection. Now, some people, their connections, which are very important, is to a higher force or some sort of transcendent experience. And I think that that connection can be used very productively. People gain strength and faith from the belief in a higher force or power. Then it's a matter of people coming to terms with that and using it in the healing process. Now, it's not something that psychiatry tends to think about, but if we go back to Carl Jung, he the psychiatrist back in the last century, one of my heroes, we really advocated the importance of people's spiritual beliefs, and that can be a very important part of treatment and healing. And it shouldn't be taken out of therapy, it should be included in the therapy.
Thank you, Nigel. That's excellent. By the way, we have lots of wonderful comments about you, Nigel, on the chat feed, and one of them is, thanks, Nigel. Great to have psychiatrists with your enthusiasm and open mindset on this trajectory. And we are thrilled to have you, and we have about 15 psychiatrists on our advisory panel, and of course David Castle on our board, and we really are very lucky that there are more and more psychiatrists, including a number on the webinar tonight, who are really looking to make these treatments available for their patients. There's a question here now, I think I'll address this one to you, Peter. I'm a psychologist who has been approached by existing clients who wish to explore psychedelic-focused therapy. As I am not a practitioner in that area, how best can I advise them to proceed when they cannot immediately travel abroad to be assisted under supervision? Peter.
The best thing you can do is find a psychiatrist who is a believer or up the learning curve in relation to these medicines. Alternatively, if you have a close connection with a psychiatrist, ask the psychiatrist to connect with us, and we'll provide the psychiatrist with all the research data. In terms of the medicines being available in Australia, obviously they're not available at the moment, but we're hopeful they'll be available soon, and a lot of work has been done on the regulatory pathway.
Here? Yeah. So if there are psychiatrists, we're trying to navigate two computers in one room, and it's very tricky. Sorry about that. If there are psychiatrists out there who want to talk with us about accessing the SASB scheme, Nigel has very kindly offered to host a group to help this come to fruition, and we're very excited about that. And we know there's some on this webinar now, so please. Can
I butt in, Tanya, and just
yes,
say,
of course.
If they want to contact me directly, that would be great. We could get a discussion group going as part of the college activity. I'm really keen to do that. We need as many psychiatrists involved, and that will help the whole process and
absolutely
speed it up a bit.
And it will help speed things up so that we can have that authorised prescriber route as well, which we've been talking about. So very exciting. Well, there we are. Someone just said, what about an RANZCP peer review group?
Yep.
So.
I'm into that, and psychiatrists in training as well, and doctors as well. It doesn't have to be, or medicos. We need as many medicos as possible, because we're the ones who will influence the treatment and carry out the treatment. It's very important that we get together. So yeah, contact me, please.
Yeah. By the way, people are asking how they can get a recording of this session. We will send out a recording to all registered participants for this recording next week, and we'll upload it to our YouTube channel. There's a question here as well. Van der Kolk, Porges, Shaw, Seagal, etc. all underscore the importance of integrating the experience of mind, body and emotional experiences for those who experience PTSD and CPTSD. However, our current Better Mental Health Access Initiative under Medicare, apart from EMDR, do not offer these opportunities. My understanding of current international trials of the use of psilocybin and MDMA is that the therapy approaches utilised are those that foreground attachment approaches, psychodynamic therapy, body-based approaches, and emotionally based approaches. How can trials in Australia proceed if these other processes are not recognised under better access scheme? I've trained overseas, do not utilise cognitive models alone, but Medicare does not recognise these strategies. Does this mean cognitive approaches will be utilised in the trials in Australia? Also, what therefore are the implications of psychotherapeutic training in Australia as a result?
Great question. Great question. Look, you know, I wrote a novel back in 2015 or 2016. I was so frustrated when we proposed a PTSD trial at Deakin University, and it was thrown out because it was too controversial. And in that introduction to that novel, I talked about the various approaches. I've done a training in Hakomi, which is a very physically orientated treatment for PTSD. I've got a very close friend who's a very well-known international art therapist, and she treats a lot of people with post-traumatic stress disorder using art therapy. There's a whole lot of approaches that are non-verbal, and I'm not going to criticise my college too overtly, but really, we really do need to broaden the approach. The book that you mentioned, written by that gentleman, really talks about that. It's a great book.
The Body Knows the Score, yeah?
And The Body Knows the Score. And I've got it right here. It's one of my Bibles. And it's not on the bedside, but it's one of the Bibles. And really, we need to expand this whole treatment process. I don't know why the approach from the college is so narrow, and it is narrow, and we need to get it out there that this whole thing needs to be broadened. And the psychedelic MDMA treatment there's got to be a physical aspect to it. It's not just psychodynamic. It covers a whole range of things. And I think we really need to revolutionise the treatment of PTSD in Australia. And that's what we're all working towards. So great question.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nigel, as you know, having been at Trip of Compassion, that really highlights the physical nature of this sort of therapy and how important that is. And we do hope that when events emerge again, that we will have some more screenings of Trip of Compassion. And indeed, we're looking at doing an online screening of Trip of Compassion as well, for those of you that may not have seen it. Yeah, and also I forgot to mention earlier, someone's just reminded me, but if you want to join one of our existing chapters or set up a Mind Medicine Australia chapter where you are, please reach out and we will help you start a chapter in your location. Another question that I've got here is this one. MAPS are considering sale of MDMA as a revenue source. Is Mind Medicine Australia considering a similar approach to more self-reliant funding models with psilocybin or MDMA? Yeah.
I mean, the answer is we're putting a lot of work into making sure that we can get secure supplies of both MDMA, medical grade MDMA and medical grade psilocybin to support these therapies. Now, obviously that's dependent upon getting the appropriate licenses in Australia because of the nature of these medicines, but there are manufacturers overseas manufacturing to that standard, and we're in contact with them. In terms of the provision of the medicines in Australia as and when that's permitted, we're a not-for-profit organisation, so we have zero interest in making money out of the medicines. To the extent that they can help subsidise some of the costs, that would be excellent. But the major thing we want to do is make sure these medicines are available in therapy at a cost that's affordable, not just to wealthy people, but at a cost affordable to all Australians, irrespective of wealth or demographic group.
Yeah. Thank you. And there's another question in here. Okay, here, this one I think is for you, Nigel. Considering that in general, when SSRIs and SNRIs are mixed with tryptamine or phenylethylamine psychedelics such as MDMA, psilocybin and LSD, it has been reported that psychedelics lose their edge and don't produce the intense subjective effects characterising psychedelic experiences. What issues, challenges have we identified here? What is the strategy going forward? Nigel, you might want to comment on that and how it's necessary to go off these SSRIs before certain of the psychedelic group of medicines.
Yeah, well, look, it's simple as that. People have to, with the permission of their treaters, obviously, with antidepressants, to go off the antidepressants and obviously be carefully monitored while they're off the antidepressants during the trial. Look, I'm not a pharmacologist, so I can't really comment any further than that.
Another question here, and I think this is something that we all would love to know, is, what are the thoughts on long-term follow-up for psychedelic integration therapy at 12 months and beyond? So far the trials, of course, have been up to 12 months, but a lot of people say that to maintain the therapeutic benefit, people may have to have top-up sessions potentially every 6 months or annually. And what are your thoughts on that, Nigel?
Yeah, that's right. And one of the early researchers who was doing work at Harvard with psychedelics said that to me once, that in fact what they're finding, and it's so early in the research that we really don't know for sure, that people, if they're given psilocybin, the whole process is to shake up the thinking in the brain, stop the small circuitry and open up the brain to other ideas and concepts. That things might close down again. There might be a tendency for things to close down. So people may need 6 months or 12 months kickstarts. Top-ups, that's the word. And that could be a possibility. I think what we'll probably find, and I'm not sure, is that some people I've heard of people who have taken MDMA-assisted, had MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. They've had one dose. Rick Doblin told me this. One dose. They finished the session. That's it. I feel terrific, and they were never seen again, and they were cured. Other people need to have 3 sessions, and some people may need to go back 6 months later. So I think we can't just tie it down. It depends on each individual.
And Nigel, just another question just came up there that sort of ties into this, is that, some people believe that microdosing then could be a good adjunct to an ongoing healing process and integration process. Is that your belief or not?
Well, no, you don't ask me about I don't really support microdosing. I don't think there's any evidence. But I tell you, along the lines of microdosing, back in the 60s and 70s when it was legal in Australia, there were a lot of psychotherapists who would use it, but in small doses to facilitate the therapy. So people wouldn't necessarily have mystical or transformative experiences, but it would help the therapy. But microdosing, I'm not certain that really that's the approach. So I stand neutral on that one.
Thank you for that. And another question here. Hang on a moment. I work in a private mental health hospital that specialises in treating veterans with PTSD. We would be well positioned to host a trial for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD in the future with psychologists and psychiatrists already involved who are plant medicine aware and supporting individuals to integrate their experiences in their private work. Any advice on or support on how to start a conversation with the currently conservative research team? Okay, well, the answer to that one is please contact us, and we'll bring Nigel and some other experts in to talk with your conservative team and give them some of the evidence and the science so that they can actually get up the curve and start leading the way, because it sounds like your hospital and facility is very well suited to this research.
Can I add something here, Tanya?
Yeah,
look,
sure.
I've been banging on doors and talking to colleagues who are experts in post-traumatic stress disorder about the introduction of this treatment, and it's been very frustrating. It's great that the momentum's increasing. What's going to happen, this is my prediction, is that once the floodgates open, there'll be a flood. We're just getting to that point now where the dam wall's about to break and the resistance is stopping, but the stigma of the drug is still around and people are still conservative. But if we keep pushing, we'll get there, and it'll happen soon. Okay. And I feel very optimistic about that.
No, thank you for that, Nigel. I'll just see, Ilan, did you pick up any other one there? Yeah, no, we won't do that one. No. So we have questions here about the therapist training program, which we're launching on June the 1st. How much of the training course in 2021 will be focused on MDMA treatment for PTSD? The answer to that is that the course will train participants to work with both MDMA and psilocybin and potentially other psychedelics as well. So there'll be quite a focus on MDMA in that course. I've seen a sneak preview of the content of the course, and it's very exciting. It's important to know that we have about 250 GPs, psychiatrists, psychologists, drug and addiction counsellors, and mental health nurses who are all expressing interest in the course. So we do recommend that you get in early to register for the course. Other questions about the training, if people, there's quite a few questions there, but if people want to send them into us, we will have Renee and Alana, who are the psychologists working on the course, reply to you directly. What we're going to do now is, the 2-day workshop in November is an introductory workshop. It's not training, it's an introductory workshop to psychedelic therapies. It will be very interactive, and it will be quite different to the certificate that we'll be holding in 2021, but it'll be a wonderful way to meet others and to learn a number of skills and facilitation methods that will be very helpful in your practice. So if you haven't registered already, we suggest you do. We've had over 300 people register for the introductory workshop and summit so far. And in spite of the COVID crisis, we hope that by November, we will be able to host the summit. And if for some reason we're not able to, we'll move it into early 2021. It will definitely go ahead. And we're definitely not going to host it as a virtual webinar, because we want people to actually connect and get to know one another. There's plenty of virtual psychedelic webinars though, if you want to go and join them. And we applaud them for being out there at the moment. And now what we'll do, sorry, have we released the application process? No, but we will release that before June the 1st. Have we released the process for the course? We will release that over the next couple of weeks, I believe, and the qualifications required, etc. Ilana, if you could make a note, we'll put something on the website with that fairly soon. What we can do now, and which people really like, is that if you wish to ask a question, you can do what's called, I think it's called a hand wave, or raise your hand and unmute yourself, and then Peter, Nigel, myself will attempt to answer the questions in turn. Is that you, Peter, that is, do you have a question there, Peter? Blaisdell? No? Okay.
Sorry, I don't have a camera, but my microphone's on. Can you guys hear me?
Sorry?
I have a question. I don't have a camera.
Oh, okay. Yes.
I just wanted to say for those of you guys who are in the audience that haven't had any experience with these psychedelic medicines, from someone who suffers from chronic anxiety, and I've spent thousands of dollars on treatments. I've seen psychiatrists, psychologists, hypnotherapy, neuroemotional technique, naturopaths, and I can honestly say that nothing comes anywhere near as close to what these medicines can do for someone who suffers from a mental illness. I actually did an ayahuasca ceremony last Wednesday night, which is why I wasn't part of the webinar. And it was the most life-changing thing that I've ever done. It was essentially 30 years of therapy in one session. But one of the big things which I'm curious to ask you guys is, part of a psychedelic experience is not just you go in and you heal and stuff, but it's learning what you embrace in that experience and being able to integrate that back into your everyday life. So for me, it was a lot to do with my parents, which I've come home since and had that open conversation with them. Are you guys able to help once these people come to you and take these medicines to integrate what they've learned?
Sorry, I should have mentioned that. Life? And actually, Lana, if you could make a note to put that on how we can help slide. So one of the things that we've recently launched is a psychedelic services program, which is run by psychologists, clinical psychologists, where for people like yourself who are using these medicines for healing, you can be helped with integration through that service. And that's available also for doctors and psychiatrists out there who may not be as experienced with these medicines and want to have integration and support from people who are very experienced with the medicine. So we are offering that service, and we're having an enormous amount of demand for that.
If I can just add to that, we're a charity that's very much focused on regulatory approved psychedelic medicine. And so we're not advocating in any way that people go out there and take these medicines. And indeed, part of our charitable status is dependent upon us being completely focused on the medicinal use of these medicines in a regulatory approved manner. Having said that, the reality is people do take them, and this service is designed to help people who, for whatever reason, have decided to do that.
And it's a very confidential service as well, so that if you put an inquiry into that, it only goes to the psychologists, and of course they treat that like any patient with utmost confidentiality. So your information will not be shared with anyone else, etc. On the other hand, if there are those of you out there who have experienced enormous healing through using the medicines and wish to send in a testimonial to us, we will be happy to share that on our testimonials page. We don't have to put your surname, but it's important for this movement that people understand just how effective these medicines are. And so what you said, Nathan, there in terms of your own healing in comparison to the other modalities that you've tried, it's very, very important, and we'd value a short statement from you if you wanted to share that.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I just say too that these substances are not, it's not an easy experience to go through. You will explore the deepest, darkest realms of your conscious and things that, I mean, I had visions from when I was about 3 years old with my father and stuff. So these are very anti-addictive substances, but it's definitely something that needs to happen. So I fully support what you guys are doing, and I'll definitely do my part to help you guys make these medicines available to people who are suffering from mental illnesses.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you. You know, there's nothing more important than hearing from people with lived experience.
And I just say that, again, it emphasises the importance of getting this as part of our medical system, with a legal system that supports that and supports doctors who decide that it's appropriate for a patient, and the patient decides it's appropriate.
Absolutely.
So that's the mission, and hopefully that will happen in a shorter time as possible.
Awesome. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you. So if other people have a question they want to raise their hand, Ilan, if you can just be looking at that for me, that'd be good. I'll just have a look on this. Okay, anyone else on the chat screen?
Joe, it's
Nicola. Hi, Nicola.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
Good.
Nigel, I approached you with this a couple of years ago, but since then a lot happened, and there's more information coming up.
Sure.
I mean, I started to apply ketamine in my practice, and there's quite a few other mental health professionals around the world who are using it. And in my experience, and a lot of my colleagues' experience who are using it, there's very similar effects can be achieved with ketamine in the right setting as you achieve with MDMA. What are your views on that?
Nigel, would you like to comment on that as well? That would be quite useful.
Yeah. In fact, I was on when we spoke about it. I was on one of my bushwalks, keeping an eye out for snakes last time we spoke, Nicola. Look, I'm just someone. I've heard. I guess I've seen people who have taken ketamine for other reasons. It's used in pain relief too, as you may know, and I've seen a lot of side effects. I appreciate that ketamine can be therapeutic. It's not something that I really know a lot about. I've just been a bit reluctant to advocate it, but I appreciate that you're probably doing some good work with it, and I know that there are psychiatrists all over the place who are using it. So it probably will be part of the armamentarium eventually, and you probably will be someone who can contribute a lot with your knowledge and your experience.
Absolutely agreed with that. And Peter, did you want to comment on the ketamine as well? Because we've been doing more research into that. Nicola, I think, Nicola, by the way, Peter and I would like to have a further conversation with you about that.
Okay.
So let's line that up.
Yeah, and as you know, there's a big trial taking place at the moment in Sydney, run out of University of New South Wales. So you know, it's something very much happening at the moment, and we're watching it with great interest. The big difference seems to be that with ketamine, the therapeutic side from the therapist seems to be less relevant. And maybe that's something that needs to change. But again, that's not an area that we've really focused on to date.
Any other quick questions before we wrap up? We will send, do you want to put Nigel? If you send a note to us, if you want to connect to the psychiatry group, we will connect you in all together, and we're amalgamating a list. So actually, if people just send me or Mind Medicine Australia a note, we'll hook up the whole group, because we've already got quite a lot of psychiatrists online. Nigel, I can only say that how much we're all looking forward to your next session after this one. That was excellent.
Thanks. Great, thank you.
Thank you. And if you've got any more topics you want to share, you know, feel free to let us know.
Okay.
But yeah, if there's any last questions, let us know. There's people from all over the world here, and we say hello to all the people in Italy and all over the world. New Zealand. Thank you, thank you. Thanks for all your support. We appreciate it, and we're really delighted to be doing our best to try and help people who are suffering in this beautiful country. Thanks all.
Thank you, Nigel.
Thanks, Nigel. Bring on live events soon. We're getting a little stir crazy here. Thanks, everyone.